Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome on a cold December night in the UK to the 19th Burntwood Lecture, the Institution of Environmental Sciences annual opportunity for an eminent speaker to talk about an important contemporary environmental issue. My name is Gary Cass, and my day job is as Deputy Chief Scientist within Natural England. I also hold a visiting professorship at the University of Surrey Centre for Environment and Sustainability. But the reason I'm appearing on your screens tonight is that I'm the current chair of the Council of the IES. My term in office ends next April, so this will be the last time I'll have the honour of introducing the Burntwood Lecture. And during my time in office, I've presided over Burntwood Lectures given by Professor Cathy Willis, Sir Ian Boyd. And now we continue that tradition of exceptional speakers with tonight's lecture being delivered by Professor Jim Skea. The impacts of COVID-19 have affected us all, and it's meant that this is the first Burntwood Lecture to be held entirely virtually. And it's excellent to see so many of you in attendance this evening. Rihanna, our amazing organizer, tells me we have nearly 600 people registering and joining us from 21 different countries. This is truly wonderful. We would like to make the most of this online format, and after 9 months of practice, I'm sure we're all familiar with the workings of Zoom. Please do use the chat functions for any comments and discussion around the themes of the lecture that you want to share with other attendees. But please write any questions for the speaker in the Q&A box. Alternatively, if you wish to ask your question directly to the speaker or chair, please use the raise hand function. You will then receive permission to use your microphone and ask your question directly. If you have social media open in another browser tab or on a mobile device, the hashtag for tonight's event is hashtag Burntwood20. That's Burntwood with a capital B. The lecture is being recorded and will be made available to everyone on the IES YouTube channel after the event. And what we're discussing today naturally has a lot of relevance in society as a whole, but it holds a special importance for our organisation. IES is the professional body for environmental science. And as a thought leader in the field, we've been at the heart of discussions and debates about the relationship between science, society and the environment for nearly 50 years. And tonight is only the beginning of the IES's work between now and the COP26 next year in Glasgow. Details are still in development, and you'll hear much more from the IES as we work to bring expert voices together over the next 12 months. Please do stay connected to these developments, and if you're not already a member, please consider joining the IES. We're very open and welcoming, and we have membership types available for both practicing environmental professionals and those with a more general interest in the topic. So over the next year, as the COP approaches, we're planning to facilitate 6 topical conversations themed around the stages on the road to the COP. Each conversation will be a chance for everyone across the profession and the sector more widely to come together, to learn from each other and to speak as one voice. And some of these voices, Jonathan Porritt, Maria Christina Duval, Pete Brotherton and Pankaj Bhatia, will be responding to tonight's lecture. And we have chosen a very popular date for today's Burntwood. Ironically, we find ourselves victims of climate policy as the UK Prime Minister is delivering his carbon budget this afternoon. And it's meant that Roger Harrabin, the BBC's environment analyst, who was due to host our lecture tonight, is no longer able to join us. The lecture and the discussion afterwards will now be chaired by Julie Hill. Julie is currently Vice Chair of the IES and will take up the chair next April. She's currently Chair of WRAP, the UK's Waste and Resources Action Programme, also holds a visiting professor at Surrey University, and is former Director of and now Associate of Green Alliance and author of The Secret Life of Stuff. I'm both grateful and delighted that Julie has stepped in this evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Professor Jim Skea, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3 for the 6th assessment cycle and Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College in London. Jim was Research Director of the UK Energy Research Centre from 2004 to 2012, and throughout his career has operated at the interface between research, policymaking and business. He was a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change from its inception in 2008 until 2018, and is currently chairing Scotland's Just Transition Commission. Until June 2017, he was president of the UK Energy Institute, and Jim was awarded an OBE for services to sustainable transport in 2004, and a CBE for outstanding services to sustainable energy in 2013. So welcome again, and I'm very happy now to hand over to Jim Skea to give the 2020 Burntwood Lecture. Jim, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary, and say I'm quite honoured to give this lecture in this virtual format. What I wanted to start by doing was to explain the somewhat enigmatic title of the talk, Coherent Scientific Advice in Support of Environmental Action. And when I talked about this with Gary, what seems like many months ago to talk about this was anticipated to be a 40-minute lecture in a physical setting, in which we talked about giving a sort of more philosophical kind of lecture about different strands of scientific advice and how they came together, how they might contradict each other, and it would be supported by a case study based on land-based climate mitigation actions. As we are now down to 15 to 20 minutes in a slightly different format, I think we took the decision to bring the case study to the foreground, but just make a few remarks about the original context as why we're interested in this question of environmental advice that might be going in different directions. Now, I wanted to start by just reminding ourselves, this is going back some time, but at the Earth Summit in 1992, it spawned off 3 different environment-related conventions on climate change, on biological diversity, and on desertification. And arguably, it's the Convention on Climate Change that has attracted the most attention and the greatest number of headlines. It's had managed to be more energetical, so it's had 25 conferences of the party since 1992, whereas the other 2 conventions have had 14 conventions, conference of the party each. I should say that the Convention on Biological Diversity is actually beginning to catch up, I think, with IPCC, because as we acknowledge the Anthropocene, it's quite clear that we have a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis, and that can perhaps be part of the talk that is going to come up. Now, more relevant for this lecture is the question that each of these conventions effectively has a scientific doppelganger that sits beside it. So the Convention on Climate Change has IPCC, which was founded in 1988, actually preceding the Earth Summit and the Framework Convention. We have the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which was created in 2008, which shadows the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the Convention to Combat Desertification doesn't have a doppelganger body. It has a science policy interface that's actually fully part of the convention itself. But in addition to that, we have an international resource panel that kicked off in 2007 on UNEP's Global Environmental Outlooks, which kicked off in 1997. And the common theme there is that each of these bodies, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, actually plays a very significant role. IPCC is the exception because the World Meteorological Organization co-governs it along with UNEP. But I think the interesting thing is now, having established all these bodies, it has become, I think, a little bit of a concern to UNEP that they might be saying different things about similar topics, given that their interests do overlap somewhat. So 2 or 3 years ago, UNEP put something together called the Global Assessment Coherence Group, which involved leaders from each of these bodies to try to stitch together a process by which a coherent view could be presented. Now, UNEP quickly realized that if you called something a coherence group, it implied that what went before was incoherent. So fairly quickly, the name was changed to the Ad Hoc Global Assessment Dialogue. But still, there's a clear issue here that if you have multiple bodies that draw together different disciplines of science, they may end up saying slightly different things on the same topic. And that's where that was really the overall theme and the reason for picking up the title of this talk. But as I said, I'm going to approach this by basically taking a case study of land-based mitigation and how a diversity of different scientific perspectives has come in there. And I'm going to do that by looking at 2 of the IPCC's recent special reports. Their special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which came out just over 2 years ago, and the special report on climate change and land, which is about 15 months old now. And just to say, it was Working Group 3 of IPCC, of which I'm one of the co-chairs, which managed the special report on climate change and land. So I know where all the bodies are buried, if you pardon the metaphor there. And along with the other working groups, we were part of the scientific leadership for the global warming of the 1.5 degrees report. So I'll take what each of these reports has said about land-based mitigation, and then talk a little bit about how the different approaches may fit together. Now, the first thing I want to say about the report on global warming of 1.5 degrees is that it was an extraordinarily interdisciplinary exercise. It was the co-product of 3 working groups, 3 of the IPCC's working groups together: physical science, impacts adaptation and vulnerability, and mitigation. And this was the first time IPCC had ever pulled off that kind of interdisciplinary exercise. And I might say in parenthesis that this has been the most interdisciplinary of all the IPCC cycles. The 3 working groups have really pulled together. We've learned interdisciplinary habits, partly because of the special reports and partly, frankly, because we want to and believe in it. And one of the things, for example, we're doing is we're developing a common glossary for terminology that cuts across all 3 working groups to try and remove ambiguities. And believe me, some of the most interesting scientific discussions that we've had in the entire cycle have been about determining terms like carbon neutrality or net zero, and getting it in to a common glossary that we all understand, all understand together. So this is really a strong point of the report. But one thing we did notice when putting the report together is the very different kind of philosophical framings that people say from the climate impacts group would bring to such a study, who tend to think what scientifically needs to happen, what needs to happen in terms of mitigation in order to protect natural and human systems, where we in the mitigation part of the report tend to think, start from where we are now and think what can be done, what is the feasibility. And the aspiration, of course, is that we can meet in the middle, and what is necessary can also be feasible in moving forwards. So the report had 2 homework questions. One, the governments that came at the invite of UNFCCC, and it asks us about the impacts of 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, and it asked about associated mitigation pathways. I'm going to do the mitigation bit, but just to say on the impact side, the report clearly identified big differences in impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. And we can flag out warm water corals and the Arctic Ocean as 2 particular areas where very, very big differences between the 2 levels of warming. But on the mitigation side, the conclusions were fairly clear. On this, the graph on the left represents pathways for carbon dioxide emissions out to the year 2100. And the very simple message for scenarios in the blue band here, all of which are more or less compatible with 1.5 degrees warming, is that they need to reach net zero carbon dioxide, and I'd emphasize carbon dioxide, not greenhouse gas emission reductions, by the middle of the century, plus or minus 5 years or a decade or so, and that by 2030, emissions would need to be of the order of 45% below levels that are there at the moment. On the right-hand side, it shows for non-CO2 emissions, things like methane, nitrous oxides. And in these kinds of scenarios, you would expect methane and nitrous oxide emissions to fall, but you absolutely would not expect them to fall to or below 0. So the other thing I want you to note about the graph on the left-hand side, there are grey areas at the top left and the bottom right. And these are scenarios that actually overshoot 1.5 degrees of a higher level of warming. And this basically occurs if you delay emissions reductions too long, and you then need to compensate for it with more negative emissions in the second half of the 21st century, which is the source of one of the controversies. Because this concept of temperature overshoot can be extremely controversial. Many of the models that were used to run these pathways on the previous slide try to optimize cumulative carbon dioxide emissions over the 21st century. And they achieve it by overshooting the temperature, first of all, and using negative emissions to pull it back again. And this raises all sorts of challenging issues about the irreversible impacts of climate change at a given warming level, whether you go over tipping points, and even slightly more provocatively, by the time you get to the middle of the century, you might actually ask one to the question, is it worthwhile deploying the measures that would bring the temperature back down again? Or could the cure be worse than the disease by the time you've got to that level? So one of the ways that we explored these issues in a bit detail, and again, this is reliant on a particular set of models, so-called integrated assessment models, is that there are different pathways compatible with 1.5 degrees warming, but they have very different characteristics. And the question of the promptness of action is the critical factor. So the solid blue lines in each of these 4 illustrative pathways represent net carbon dioxide emissions, hitting net zero about in the middle of the 21st century. The grey part represents emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The orange part is sinks or sources from agriculture, forestry and land use. And the yellow part, which is the controversial bit I'll be getting onto, are removals from the atmosphere by using bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, where the net effect of the system is exactly to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by growing plants, which are then burnt, capturing the carbon, and then storing the carbon in geological resources. So this is a controversial technology for a number of reasons, not least because it's never really been done on any scale. I should say all the elements are perfectly achievable technically, but we've never had the economic incentives or the business models to allow it to take place. And I'll come along to the ecological side of it, but one thing just to flag up, you can look at the volumes in pathways 3 and 4, which are going in excess of 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removed by BECCS by the year 2100. And if you do the calculation, you'll find that there's about 11 gigatons of oil and gas actually running through pipelines in the present day energy system. So this is truly a colossal turnaround in terms of the way of doing things. And without doubt, I think if you're from an environmental perspective, concerned about environmental issues, pathways 3 and 4 look desperately implausible for various reasons. And pathway 1 at the other end involves reducing fossil fuel emissions by 7% per year continuously for 30 years. And just to flag up how challenging that is, the IEA estimates that the COVID crisis has actually caused carbon dioxide emissions to fall by 7% just in 2020. You need to add all of these together over 30 years to get onto pathway 1. So a very strong set of conclusions. All of the pathways in these models that limit warming to 1.5 degrees use carbon dioxide removal, which could include planting trees as well as the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It compensates from residual emissions from hard to abate sectors, and in most cases, it also achieves net negative emissions. And BECCS, this controversial idea, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, features in most of the scenarios and is avoided only in very few that involve very dramatic early reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. Now let's turn to the second report that was produced just over a year ago. And this report was even more interdisciplinary. It involved all of the 3 working groups. It included the task force on inventories for IPCC, because there are some desperately important issues about how you measure and estimate fluxes of carbon dioxide in particular, and estimate them at the global level. And the author team also contained many people from the IPBES, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services community as well. And this raised very further interesting issues that IPCC authors and IPBES authors were working together on the same chapters. Now, one of the interesting things, one of the big actually movements in this report was to treat the food system as a whole, I have to say, and it was a big advance, but I'll cover that less here. I'll focus much more on the response options. And one of the big messages we got from that report, it doesn't really mean very much to split our management response between mitigation and adaptation, because most options that we looked at have multiple benefits. And we chose instead to divide the responses in 3 different ways. By broad type is about managing land differently. Is it about value chain management, which we could in things the way the dietary issues, loss and waste in the food chain, etc., and risk management, which is about wider issues like diversification of livelihoods. We also divided responses by their mitigation potential globally. And the motivation for doing that is that there are some responses like BECCS that are motivated pretty entirely by mitigation. But interestingly, I think the most critical factor in dividing up different responses was their impact on land competition. Did they involve little competition for land, or did they entirely rely on it? And that was a very, very big divide. So one advantage of doing this virtually is that you can actually see small text on the screen. This was never intended to be read. It was intended to be an impressionistic picture. But basically, we looked at 28 different land response options that could be implemented without real competition for land. We then assessed them against 5 criteria. Do they mitigate? Do they help you adapt? Do they combat desertification? Do they help reverse land degradation? And do they promote or do they inhibit food security? And basically, blue is a good thing and orange is a bad thing. And the deeper the color, the more significant the impact is. So I just wanted to flag up that almost all of these measures are good things if you do not have competition for land. Many include nature-based solutions, which are not included in the models largely that I showed you from the 1.5 degrees report. But many of these solutions, which are more nature-based, can have big impacts. So increased food productivity, agroforestry, reduced forestation and forest degradation, increasing soil organic content, fire management, restoration of coastal wetlands, and all of the demand side changes like reducing post-harvest losses, dietary change, and reducing food waste. So quite an optimistic picture there about the contribution that these more nature-based solutions can contribute. On the other hand, when you go to the different measures where land use changes involve, this slide applies to afforestation, where you look at the same criteria, and it's a very different picture because there are big potential negative implications on food security if cropland is turned over to planting trees on a very large scale. But an emphasis there, it depends how the scale on which you do it. And there are many areas where actually if you plant forests on degraded land, mangroves or other marginal land not used for agriculture, it can actually benefit food security. So the scale really matters. We did the same exercise for bioenergy and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And there, as well as location, as well as the scale, the specific location, the selection of crops, and the management practices were absolutely critical. But if you do it at the gigaton scale, there are real tensions with adaptation and food security, not so much evidence on desertification and land degradation. But again, this is not a message that bioenergy is bad, because if it's done in the right kind of way and managed properly, you can get positive contributions and have a kind of neutral effect in terms of food security. So the way you do it matters. And if we're going to pull everything out of this and kind of simplify it, the headline conclusion was one that was a kind of compromise between the kind of the modelers who were part of the report and the people who were more concerned about biodiversity and ecosystem services, that better land management can play a significant part in tackling climate change. But a very important point to make, it can't do it all. You cannot rely on land-based measures completely to solve it. We need radical action in relation to fossil fuel industry and the demand side in order to move things on. Now, one thing I should mention, since Pankaj Bhatia is on this, that I think the land-based measures are incredibly important because many countries and organizations are relying on offsets to set, say, net zero carbon targets or net zero or carbon neutrality. And many of the potential offsets can be purchased through land management options. So getting the land management side of this is critical. And I think we've all realized that in the past, we've considered climate change to be an energy kind of issue on the mitigation side. We now recognize that the land sector plays an absolutely critical role. Now, I'm coming to the end of this, but one thing is that a question of why different UNEP reports under the UNEP family might come to different conclusions. And one of the questions is the orientation with respect to policy. And as many of you may know, authors within IPCC are told as like the first commandment, you can be policy relevant, but do not be policy prescriptive. Otherwise, governments won't deal with it. And it's very interesting to go through the summary for policymakers for GO6 and discover the number of normative statements in it. So I found 11 shoulds and 2 musts in there. In the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, I find 1 should only, and then it was used in a very conditional way in the sense of the something might happen. And one of the reasons around that, I think, is the different relationships between scientists and the policy system for the different reports. If you take a look at the people who turn up for GO6 approval sessions, they're people from environment ministries and wildlife trusts. They're much more receptive to prescriptive statements about what needs to be done to resolve environmental issues. In IPCC, whether we like it or not, on the other side of the table, we have people from finance ministries, ministries of petroleum, etc., providing a lot of challenge. We have to choose our words very carefully. And sometimes in IPCC, we look at IPBES, GO6 jealously and think, I wish we could get away with these statements and be as forthright as our colleagues on the other reports. And just to say, to finish off, we're currently in the middle of preparing the IPCC Working Group 3 report, and a lot of the tensions that I've mentioned already are already being discussed with authors. We have a chapter 3 on mitigation pathways compatible with long-term goals, which will use these integrated assessment models again to look over the 21st century. We have a specific chapter on agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. And a chapter on cross-sectoral perspectives will look at a wider range of carbon dioxide removal options, including enhanced weathering, for example, will be picked up there. And I'll just finish off my final slide, which is slightly more literary. I think, as a co-chair of an IPCC working group, we have all the kind of tribes under our tent. On one of the statements from F. Scott Fitzgerald that actually that we like to keep in mind there is the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to take 2 opposed ideas in mind at the same time and retain the ability to function. And that is really the challenge of an IPCC working group co-chair. I don't know if we do it intelligently, but we aspire. And I remembered that quote, and then I came across the second one when I was getting it exactly right. You don't write because you want to say something, you write because you've got something to say. And just to say, I'll be using it as an introduction to our next lead authors meeting as we prepare our summary for policymakers. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope it's been of some interest. And at this point, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass back to Julie, I think.
Yes, Jim, thank you very much indeed. I'm hoping my audio is okay. Jim, thank you. You and I have known each other quite a long time, but it's a great honour to welcome you in this context and to the IES Burntwood. Also an honour to stand in for Roger Harrabin. I hope I'll do justice to the questioning in the way he would have done. And I can't help thinking, Jim, when I started my career in the environmental movement, the idea of climate change, the very concept of climate change, was considered something very fringe, almost lunatic, actually. And I'm talking about, sort of late 70s, early 80s. And now there's all this science, so much science that you've just outlined for us. But I guess another thing comes to mind in the present context, which I think a lot of people would be thinking about. One of the things COVID has done for us is really shine a spotlight on the relationship between scientific expertise and policy, particularly where there's divergent views, which are increasingly being aired. And I just wondered how you felt that places us now with the debate about climate science and its relationship to policy? Does it make it more difficult that we've shone such a spotlight on divergence and uncertainty, or is that kind of transparency and debate actually rather helpful for us here?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think I would say about COVID and climate change is the some similarities in the sense of crisis, because they really bring it home to us that big global trends and events can actually touch people's lives in a very direct kind of way. And I think there are some lessons that we can learn from COVID about this. The things that we've experienced and caught up in a matter of months for COVID will actually hit us, maybe not in months, but in years over the future, you know, as we move forward. And indeed, of course, there's a lot of countries that suffer from climate impacts already know that, you know, climate change is already upon us, and we're seeing the impacts there. But more on the scientific side that you picked up, it's very interesting that you know, for a while experts were the word expert was a filthy word, as it were, and it's quite interesting. Although people may have disagreed, the experts are now back in fashion again, and are actually quite acceptable in terms of moving forward. And I do think that is a good thing. And I think it's actually, you know, science moves forward by people disagreeing with each other and finding out and reconciling differences in opinion. And one of the great things about the last IPCC cycle is it has brought people together. By the time we get the next assessment report out, we are going to be on top of some of these differences and have a better explanation and a better understanding within different scientific communities. So in that sense, I'm really quite optimistic about it.
Okay. Good. Well, that's good to hear. A lot of what you said was pretty sobering, but so we're throwing an awful lot of science at it. Okay, so so the way this is going to work now, we have 4 very eminent respondents lined up to give brief observations, maybe ask you questions. So I'm going to go to those first, and then after that, there's an open Q&A. If you want to ask a written question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat. Use the Q&A. And that will be curated a bit by Rihanna from the IES. But we do also have the facility to take some questions live, as it were. We can open your mic if you raise a hand. And I'm going to have a go at blending the two. We'll see how that goes, but and try and draw some sort of general themes out. But I'm going to go first to one of our respondents. I'm told that Sophie is ready to be first up. So Sophie, if I could bring you in. Sophie Marjanac, you'll have to tell me if I've got that right. And Sophie is climate accountability lead and a senior lawyer at ClientEarth. And so Sophie, did you just want to make an observation or ask a question of Jim?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and that was really fascinating, Jim, to listen to the inside story from the IPCC as someone, a practitioner who works with those documents really frequently. It's really interesting to hear about how they come together. A thought that occurred to me during your presentation arose perhaps from the pathways P1 to 4 in the IPCC special report SR 115, and your discussion of the quantities of negative emissions that are needed. As environmentalists, are we wasting, and perhaps this is slightly provocative, but deliberately so, are we wasting our time in talking about pathways 3 and 4 and those kinds of BECCS technologies? Are we really arguing about whether we want striped or spotted unicorns? And perhaps ought we to be focusing on, you know, pathways that only include those technologies that are available today? What's your view on that?
Oh, okay, Julie, I expect you to come back on that directly. I mean, the choice of the pathways and which one people think is feasible really goes back to that issue about the people who think what needs to be done versus what can be done. there, that this is almost the issue. I don't think bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is necessarily a unicorn, because all parts of it have actually been done somewhere. We've grown biomass crops, we've burnt them in power stations, we've captured carbon dioxide, and we have actually stored it in geological formations. It's just that we've never joined the four things up together and done it all at once. But I do perfectly understand that it's a really difficult business proposition to put that supply chain together, but it is possible. Now, I personally find it quite implausible that the amount of carbon BECCS that is used in pathways 3 and 4 are really credible. I have to say, I also think that pathway 1 is a little bit incredible as well, however might desirable it look, because it involves emissions falling at 7% a year from 2020 onwards. We're already to 2020. We're not seeing the climate action coming through from governments. So I think we're somewhere in the middle there. And what I think we need to think is the sequence in which policymakers make decisions. The first decision is how ambitious to be and just get on with it, quite frankly. And I think we could all agree that there's an absolute need to move as quickly as possible to deal with conventional emissions. But it may be that further down the line that we need to build in these technologies that are not yet there for deployment, some decades down the line, though not necessarily at the scale that you've seen there. And as I've also suggested, the nature-based solutions are not built into these models. There's an awful lot could be done with more benign kind of land-based solutions.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, Jim, interestingly, coming up in the chat, there are quite a few comments to the effect that, well, if emissions only fell 7% during this year, when it felt like the world pretty much stopped, well, for one thing, why was it only 7%? And for another, actually, if that's the case, is it really realistic that we're going to meet any of these trajectories given what would have to happen? So I don't know if you want to embrace a few of those questions just while we're here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 7% is the number that the IEA has come up with the estimate. I mean, I haven't plowed the way through the calculations, but I kind of trust them to do the numbers. And a big chunk of that is going to come through in the transport sector, where we've seen a lot less. People have travelled less to work. Some industrial sectors may have operated less. But on the other hand, there's an awful lot of activity that's gone on pretty much as it is. But you can see the big effect that's had on people's lives. I mean, the projections from the IEA, and they've played around, I think, with the idea of where emissions might be. And I should say this is business as usual, inverted commas, rather than any big mitigation effort, is that we might be 10 or 20% below where we otherwise would have been in carbon dioxide emissions by the end of the 2020s. And some of that is partly because of changed expectations about renewable energy costs, and some of it is about the shadow of the COVID effect.
Okay, so still several comments about, you mentioned radical action. What does that look like? We'll maybe come back to that. Sophie, did you want to come back on anything from that part of the debate?
I just think it's really interesting the way that the science often plays into and will play into the political debates and how far policy is willing to go. Obviously, you mentioned, Jim mentioned the oil and gas sector. Obviously, the scenarios that they tend to use include, basically quite self-serving assumptions. So I think it's just important for us to all understand the basis of those scenarios, where they come from, how the models work, so that we can really hold them to account and question these kinds of assumptions, because obviously everything is based on so many different assumptions about the future.
Yeah, and as I think some of the original modelers, I think Donella Meadows said, all models are wrong, but some are useful, or has quoted, certainly, I'm not sure she was the original source, but that's a slight caveat, I guess, we have to put on some of the models, and the political interpretation is what counts, isn't it? Sophie, thank you very much. I'm going to go to our next respondent. Peter Brotherton is Lead Director for Climate Change at Natural England. So Peter, would you like to observe or question?
Hello.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you, Jim. That was fantastic and really interesting. You've mentioned nature-based solutions a couple of times in both in your talk and then in response to the question just now. And we're really interested from Natural England, and indeed the UK government and the round, I think, is really interested in the role of nature-based solutions in addressing the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, and sees next year with the climate change COP and the CBD COP, Convention on Biological Diversity COP, is a really important year for advancing nature-based solutions. At the same time, nature-based solutions potentially competes with land, not least with BECCS, and nature-based solutions can't just be delivered by the environment sector. It needs to be something that is embraced by all parts of government and all parts of society. And in doing so, those solutions deliver not just for climate and nature, but they deliver clean air, they deliver health benefits, they deliver a whole load of additional societal benefits. So there's I think, a strong case to be made there. However, we're currently failing to make that case and currently failing to get that mainstreaming of nature-based solutions and it being seen as a solution across government. And I just wonder what your experience, particularly building perhaps on your interdisciplinary approaches with the 3 working groups that you referred to at the start, could help us learn about the approaches and the role of evidence in making that case for wider mainstreaming.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's a really good point to make, Peter. And I have to say, as my job title, Professor of Sustainable Energy, suggests, I come from an energy background, and with that IPCC report on land which we managed, I began to become completely humbled by the complexity of delivering land-based solutions. It is much more complicated than energy. And there's all sorts of complex issues like land tenure and incentives that go with it. And just to say, that's also come up in the role I have with the Just Transition Commission in Scotland at the moment, where we are paying a lot of attention to the land sector and the rural sector in terms of what might can be achieved. Because certainly in Scotland, the cultural resonance of how land is used is actually higher than just the pure economics would suggest. So in the last report the Just Transition Commission produced, which is actually about COVID recovery, we placed a lot of emphasis on things like peatland restoration, afforestation as ways in which you could actually create jobs quite quickly in the land and bring benefits quite quickly. And I think if we can demonstrate that side of it as well, but it does need a lot of education and training. I think a lot of people who manage land, could benefit, from more extension services, from more help in moving into agroforestry, perhaps other kinds of schemes. And what I would say with the IPCC report, I mean, one thing we in Working Group 3 have never been good at doing on the mitigation side is presenting case studies and good examples of what works there. And we've actually given a lot of strong steers to our authors in this cycle in the Working Group 3 report to put more case studies onto the agenda so that people can see what works and begin to share knowledge and move it around a bit. Now that's a little bit incremental, but I think that's one way to do it. The other thing I would suggest, these giant integrated assessment models, they are getting better at representing the land sector. It's been very, very crude so far. But if we can get a more sophisticated representation in there, and some groups like IASA in Austria now have a land use and a big model that fit together, that's a way I think that you can begin to demonstrate it, both with the high level modeling, but we just really need to show it can be done as well through case studies and examples.
Yeah, I'm sure that must be right, because unless people can visualize things, it's quite, however wonderful the models, and apologies for my earlier comment about models, but however good they are, being able to visualize how these solutions work. And I just know this from work with the Environment Agency, where nature-based solutions to flooding, for instance, to water management, very hard to describe, but much easier to show people on the ground. So I'm sure that must be part of it. Peter, thank you very much. Did you want to come back at all on anything Jim said?
Yeah, I think if I may just briefly, one of the opportunities with nature-based solutions is that it's something that people can see and experience and as real things that they demand. And we touched on the impact of COVID earlier. People have begun to think about local spaces and nature differently. They've begun to reconnect with nature. Perhaps this isn't a global description, but certainly in places like the UK, I think that's true. And I think setting these two agendas together, I think, are really important if we're going to bring that public demand for change with us. And so I think there's huge potential there. And I would encourage you, Jim, if you did mention that nature-based solutions aren't yet in models, and it would be great to see them built in more firmly in future land use models that IPCC work on. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Peter, very many thanks. You mentioned a global dimension, and I think we could get that now from our next, I hope our next respondent, Pankaj Bhatia. Pankaj, are you with us? You are. Welcome. Very good to see you. He's Deputy Director for Climate at the World Resources Institute and Global Director for the Greenhouse Gases Protocol. And you're joining us from where, Pankaj?
From McLean, Virginia, USA.
Okay, well, welcome. Would you like to give your brief observation and or question for Jim, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Julie. And first of all, my thanks to Professor Skea. I feel very fortunate that I have this opportunity to be attending this talk. Professor Skea briefly mentioned and referenced the work we are doing. Not sure if that link was clear, but as I heard through the talk, I feel myself also quite humbled. I think Professor Skea made that remark. I think the land sector is very complex. And one of the challenges we are facing as part of the greenhouse gas protocol work, where we are presently embarking on a new global standard for companies on how to account for impacts from the land and biogenic products. And as we've spent about 1 year now, and we're still learning, I think, and it is becoming more and more clear that the issues are very much embroiled in some of these basic, I think, modeling work that Professor Skea referenced, and that I feel is not yet fully informing the important technical discussions that we're having, and I would really like to have an opportunity for a separate follow-on. But for the sake of discussion, as we don't have a lot of time here, I'd like to make 3 important points here. The first one is in relation to nature-based solutions. I think previous panelists have also commented on it, and I think we need to consider as a global community, what do we need to make an impact on the decision makers? Because the message that I understood today was also not fully clear to me. I think Professor Skea explained it very nicely, that there is a risk of overshoot, and there is a belief that we could buy more time and compensate. But I don't think there is a clear understanding of that risk of overshoot and what are the consequences. I think we really need to understand how to communicate to the business community in particular, because they drive a lot of decisions, even with the policymakers. And I think they do present some narratives, and I'm not sure how much they are anchored in the insights that you were sharing here. So I would really recommend that we consider how to communicate more effectively. The second point I think is also similarly relevant here, that when companies report their impacts, nature-based solution as a strategy as an offsets has been talked about, but companies, some large corporations are also looking at nature-based solutions as part of their ownership and control. And I think there also our accounting system, global accounting systems are failing us. If they follow the current approach, it is quite likely, even with this ownership control approach where nature-based solution becomes part of their own lands, they will not still account for the negative impact. You know, we spoke about the competition with other human needs, and even if, you know, so businesses are not going to take care of those market effects, so to speak. And I think we need to look into the IPCC accounting system, the UNFCCC accounting systems also. So these have to come from top down, in my view, from national down to how subnational entities are going to account. And I think there is a big issue building up here that if nature-based solution as an offsets as a strategy is rejected, then companies will move towards nature-based solution as part of their ownership. And finally, I think there is an issue of how to construct an effective accounting system, particularly I think in the work that we're doing in the GHG protocol, that will provide right kinds of incentives for both upstream forest management companies and downstream biogenic product users. There is a challenge here. Right now the accounting systems are not able to address that, whether you follow stock-based accounting or flow-based accounting, and really, I think there are fundamental flaws in the accounting system that I have come to understand now that I think if not addressed, we are not going to get the right solution. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, Pankaj, you've touched on an issue for which I could go on about for hours about the accounting systems in the land-based sector. And just to flag, I mean, for people who may not be aware, the kind of accounting for land-based sources and sinks done by the models that IPCC operates is actually quite different from the accounts that countries report to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the definition of an anthropogenic emission is any emission, natural or human, that occurs on managed land, with a great deal of flexibility to define what managed land is. And the discrepancy is actually 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, which is approaching 10% of estimated global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we scientifically understand the difference, but we almost have 2 parallel accounting systems running at the moment. And it raises big questions about what we mean by net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Whose system are you using? So I am absolutely at one with Pankaj that we need to deal with this issue. We've exposed it in the land report, it's documented there, and we'll be taking it up further in the next Working Group 3 report when it comes out. So we're right on the right agenda, Pankaj, and I think we maybe need to talk together about that as well.
Yeah, agree. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So we can now go to a sort of more open Q&A. And of course, our 3 previous respondents very welcome to join in some of that. There's some interesting questions coming up in the chat. Interestingly, some sort of diametrically opposed ones. Some saying we need more firm action from government, there needs to be regulation, maybe carbon pricing, carbon credits instead of spending money. Others saying, isn't this more about individual actions? If individuals act, governments will follow. Jim, I don't know if you want, that's the sort of usual merry-go-round of who leads, who follows, how does change actually happen? Do you want to make a brief comment on that?
Yeah. Well, you can read the next entire 1,000-word IPCC report to cover all of these issues. It's such a broad topic. It's just that you think the ambition of the warming limits that we have as such under the Paris Agreement is such that you can't really use the word or. We can deal with fossil fuels, or we can deal with demand, or we can do land-based. We need to use the word and. We need all of these things. If these kind of targets are actually going to be met. So it is a mixture of everything. Otherwise, the warming limits will be exceeded. And it does include lifestyle and behavioral issues, which for the first time we've got into the next IPCC report. Governments have agreed to look at it. But it also includes land-based to complement the standard kind of energy use, renewable energy efficiency side of it as well. We need absolutely everything.
But at the same time, there has to be some leadership, doesn't there, from somewhere? I think most people imagine that if it becomes embedded in policy and there are regulatory levers, that shows sort of genuine leadership and really using the levers of change. And I suppose I'm just thinking of your experience in Scotland, your role on the Scottish Just Transitions Commission. That's a governmental initiative in Scotland to have that kind of conversation, to make that kind of analysis. Is that what we need worldwide?
Well, I mean, as well as everything, it needs that, it needs action at all kinds of levels of governance, with all kinds of, I mean, it is absolutely essential that I think you need to get top level leadership on this to send the signal so that people actually believe in it and the mood music is right. And I think the Paris Agreement was a huge achievement because it changed so many minds. There were many companies that were out there thinking, this isn't really going to happen. This is just a bunch of environmentalists. Then they looked at the Paris Agreement and said, this is real. This is happening. We need to change. And the changes in corporate behavior, probably not far enough at the moment, but they have moved a long way forward. And you need to create a combination of just creating a belief that this is the mood music. This is where we're going to go. At the same time as very practical interventions that move us in the right way. And it's not a case of one or the other. Again, it's the crest of everything all at the same time.
Okay, thank you. There's a great diversity of questions in the chat. I'll try and come back to some, but there is an opportunity now if anyone wants to ask questions live. I'm relying on Rihanna to curate this and open people's microphones and let them ask questions. So Rihanna, do we have anyone wanting to do that now?
None at the moment, but I will come back to you as soon as we get some.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're all very shy. Okay, I will carry on.
Sorry, Julie, saying that. I've got Richard Betts. Hang on.
Absolutely fine. Okay, well, here's a favourite one of mine, Jim, the political handling of uncertainty. How do we help? I think I'm looking for the exact question, but it was along the lines of how do we help policymakers and politicians handle uncertainties? And again, I guess the COVID experience is rather relevant here. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things is, uncertainty can also be a barrier to action as well. You can get paralysis through analysis. And I think we know enough to act in many ways now and get on with things. We have absolutely, we have the information that we need. There is, of course, uncertainty. We don't know which particular technologies will advance properly. There's a lot of uncertainty about the way that people's behaviors and lifestyle would respond, but we need to keep iterating on it. We need to set itself in the right direction, but keep learning from our experience as we try things out. We do know enough to act now. There are no sort of knowledge gaps that need to hold us back. There are still things to be learned, but there's enough to get on with it.
Okay, I believe we do now have a question. Richard Betts.
Hello, yes, Richard Betts from the Met Office Hadley Centre and University of Exeter. Hi Jim, thank you for a great talk. Good to hear the overview there. So speaking as a fellow IPCC author, we've changed our working practices within the IPCC this year. And we've come in under criticism for all the big conferences we have in IPCC and climate science and so on. Do you think the way that we've had to work this year will be a permanent change in IPCC work going forward? Will we be setting an example as an organisation, do you think?
I think we'll be semi-permanent, Richard. I think we both have the experience of, having, lead author meetings, which typically would be 250 people all in one part of the world for a week, and moving to online ways of doing things. And when we ran our Working Group 3 lead authors meeting back in April, we evaluated it quite carefully, including in terms of, the reduced carbon footprint. And there were pluses and minuses from doing it. On the one hand, we actually got more people to come into meetings to some extent because they did not need to travel. On the other hand, people particularly in developing countries found digital connectivity to be a real challenge in terms of participating effectively. But when we evaluated, we learned ways of doing things that I think will stick in the future. I think smaller meetings we can actually much more run virtually, and even the big lead author meetings, I think we will probably, if we get to running another physical one this cycle, which is not entirely certain, we would actually do it in hybrid format and do some of the things that we otherwise would have done physically, we would have done virtually before we get to the meeting. But I do think you know, we're also thinking about the issue of approval sessions, which can be quite contentious, and how you manage the social dynamics of an approval session with governments in a virtual format boggles my mind, quite frankly, but we may need to face up to it.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple more, I think. Would you please introduce yourselves, because I don't have everyone's names. But next question, please.
Hello, my name's Professor Steve Martin, fellow with the Institution of Environmental Sciences. I'm interested, Jim, in policy coherence and incoherence. I've been working a lot over the last few years on the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of the Nordic countries have now instituted within their ministries policy coherence units in order to overcome some of the incoherence of our policymakers. Now, we have a lot of knowledge. Your speech tonight, Burntwood Lecture, has offered us a lot of insights into the technical know-how that is available. But how do you actually square that with the incoherence of our policy leadership and how they implement some of those decisions? We're going through a crisis of COVID-19 where there's a degree of misapplication of the science, and we are also possibly facing the same sort of issue in terms of climate change. So from policy incoherence to how do we become policy coherent in our decision making?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah. That's quite a question. I mean, our IPCC reports are full of phrases like talking about the need for polycentric governance and multi-level governance, which is probably incomprehensible to many people. But I think it gets to that issue. We do need to be more joined up, and it's a perpetual theme. I mean, IPCC, you know, we are not policymakers. We're scientists, and the closer I get to the policy making process, you know, with the Scottish government and also with a committee in climate change role, the more that you kind of realize how chaotic policy making actually is when it comes down to the the practice of doing it. So look, Stephen, I can only agree with you about the need for being more joined up, but we do need to actually work on it. Now, one thing I might say, and it's a theme that comes up, is that not all policy making necessarily needs to be done at the national level. There is action that can be taken in cities, for example, and states in the United States. Sort of polities the size of an English region or Scotland can be, in some ways, a better way of joining up and doing things. Because I'm well aware that the different kind of portfolios in the Scottish government interact relatively well with each other. And if you go down to the city level, I mean, it's often the claims of the US mayors who have big ranges of responsibilities, that these are the people who can think in a joined up way about how water, waste, power systems can be joined up, traffic management can be joined up in a city, which is a way of functioning that's less possible at the national level. So I think we need to look at the ways of doing it and remember that it's multi-level as well as just trying to bring things together at, say, the Whitehall level.
Yeah, we have a question precisely to that effect, Jim, in the Q&A, saying how important city level versus national, international commitments. I mean, I guess the answer to that is probably they're a great addition to, not necessarily more or less important, excuse me, but something that can certainly lead the way in particular countries.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, we've got people in the IPCC who've done a bit of work, for example, in the US, who've been able to quantify what has been done at the city level and the state level and compare it with, what were the federal ambitions when the Obama administration was in place. It's not that easy a thing to do because they overlap, because if you've got different administrations, they may be double counting mitigation action. So there's a lot of careful accounting to be done on it, but it's certainly possible to do it.
Yeah, and certainly we've always heard quite a lot about California initiatives as leading the way in the US. Excuse me. Right, I think we have another live question from John Merlis.
It's John Merlis here. I'm a trustee of Environment Protection UK. Jim, that was a great start to a debate, I think. I was very interested in the scale of some of the measures that are going to be required, and consequently the financial side of it is very important. I see that Mark Carney is giving the Reith lectures this year and is talking about having enormous, I mean, $trillion scale carbon offset markets. Do you feel that this is something that we should look at as a way of incentivizing BESS, or do you think that this is something that will rather confuse?
Yeah, hi, and nice to talk to you again, John. But maybe Pankaj could come in that as well in terms of offset markets. But it's not really surprising that, you know, we get into the trillions when you're talking about this. There's about $2 trillion a year goes into energy sector investments at the moment, and what you would say that would need to grow a bit in you know, kind of low emission scenarios. But the biggest important change is the shift in the direction of that investment away from the high carbon from the fossil fuels into renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. And it is still somewhere in the, I think, the small number of trillions of annual investments needed in the energy sector. I am a little more skeptical about the basis for you know, offset markets to really drive it, because if you look at it, there's an awful lot of action needed within individual countries to move things forward. And I note, for example, that the Committee on Climate Change has just provided its advice to the UK government on the revised nationally defined contribution, and has recommended that offsets are not used by the UK up to the 68% reduction level that it's proposed, but they might be used as something additional to shift funds. It should be remembered that one of the big functions of offsets is to help to mobilize some of the finance that would flows from developed to developing countries. And if the offsets are a mechanism for that to happen, then I think it's very constructive.
Yeah, Mark Carney's lectures were, or the first one was certainly extraordinary. It is great to be hearing someone who was governor of the Bank of England basically critiquing conventional economics and talking about the different approaches we're going to need if we're going to solve these problems. Highly recommend listening to that. But yes, he did go quite a lot into financial mechanisms as well. Okay, I'm not sure if we have any more live questions, so I'm going to go back to the Q&A bit. And Jim, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't give you some of the more sort of technically based questions that are coming through, which would be surprising if this audience didn't have some. So I'm going to pick on one, which is about carbon capture and storage, which of course has been a rather, in the UK, has been a very long saga getting this underway. Some people may wonder if it'll ever happen. And this may not be a fair question for you, but basically the question is, which technology would you be backing?
Answer is I don't know. I mean, I think the critical thing about carbon capture and storage is that it's a you know, much more a systemic kind of thing. I think the approach of going for clusters in areas where there's strong clusters of industry would be the way to go, in which you probably need a multiplicity of different loads of carbon coming in. Some of the cheapest options may be from taking carbon dioxide, say, from chemicals industry or other parts of it. That's probably the cheapest unit cost, but you may need a power plant to give you the volume to justify getting the network up and in place. So I think it would be a variety, and I think we shouldn't jump too quickly just to say it's power sector CCS. It may help for steel, cement and other sectors as well.
Okay, and in a similar vein, also electric cars, are we leaping for the right technology here? There are a couple of comments, the extent of, you know, is this going to repeat the mistake that was made over diesel? Is this the right pathway?
I have to say, you know, I think electric cars are probably moving moving in the right direction. There's obvious issues about at the moment about the availability of the raw materials for batteries, etc., and the sourcing. But I think people will be working on using less exotic materials, and also issues about recycling batteries as well, that I think can help us quite a lot. One of the attractive things about electric vehicles is they're so simple. I mean, frankly, I like the idea of moving towards energy and other systems that have fewer moving parts. It makes it much easier. And frankly, an electric vehicle is right like that. There's less to break down. They'll be you'll need to send them in for servicing less. They actually have faster acceleration than a petrol vehicle. And once you've got past the early adoption part of it, I think people will actually take to them. And I do think it's quite plausible. I mean, the other big competing one, of course, is hydrogen fuel cell. I'm much more skeptical about that. There are particular niche reasons why it may be of interest to a country like Japan, but most of the world is going in the electric direction. And basically, the manufacturers are going there. Formula One will go in the electric direction, which will send an interesting signal. I actually do think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, Gary was kind enough to mention my book earlier on, which I was researching about 10, 12 years ago now, and we were meant to have hydrogen fuel cell powered laptops by now. Mm-hmm. So there must be, I guess there's a reason that hasn't happened. It's not delivering the promise. Jim, on a completely different tack, another question from the Q&A, population projections. Now, again, I think this is something that's gone backwards and forwards a bit. You know, are we heading for big upsurge in population, or actually will it level off faster than has been anticipated? But how is that taken into account in the IPCC projections, and how sensitive are the projections to changes in population?
Yeah. I mean, just to say, I mean, IPCC doesn't do its own research. It assesses the kind of things that people do on the outside. So people are using a lot of the standard UN projections with some variance to do it. There's one group at IASA, again, Austria, I think I mentioned them before, that has a population group that looks at a wider range of options. But basically, the UN variants are what are being used. Now, we have looked at kind of attribution analysis in IPCC. And basically it says the biggest upward driver of emissions is increasing income and wealth and economic activity. It's a far more important factor than the rise in population. So it's rising affluence, which is in developed countries, but also among the middle class and developing countries as well. That's the biggest driver of emissions increase. And frankly, the places where big population growth are happening, the individual extra people have a very low carbon footprint, and it's not really making an awful lot of difference to emissions. So it's there, it's part of the factor, but actually it's increasing affluence that is the biggest driver.
Okay, so that goes back to the point about trying to decouple what we think of as affluence, however we care to construe that in future, from the footprint. Okay, I'm getting a message that Pankaj Bhatia wants to come back on something you said. So Pankaj, can we go back to you? I think we can take your camera as well as microphone. I'm not sure.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Yes, on the offsets question, I think Professor Skea already covered. I think financing is a huge need. And how do we make sure that we mobilize the financing that is needed, and at the same time that we do not incentivize use of NBS as offsets in a way that compromises with the overall ambition and progress and ambition. And I think that's a huge problem. But also, isn't there also an issue of double counting with respect to national goals from where NBS will emerge, for developing countries in particular, and the role of Article 6? I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I think that might be another important area to consider how to fix some of the problems. And if I can finish before you respond, Professor Skea, I was also interested in your observation on setting net zero goals in the context of the land sector. And if there is some time, if you can just say a few words on what are those issues and your thoughts on how we can address them, just at a high level. I know we don't have a lot of time, but if you can, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Okay, thank you. Just on that latter point and how you define net zero goals, because of course net zero globally is not the same as net zero for every country, and it's not the same as net zero for every sector. And I think that's perhaps where, if people are setting net zero targets, that's the role and the offsets will have to play. But I think to echo what we were saying before, Pankaj, this issue of accounting for land, I think is really, really tricky. And we have two almost parallel accounting systems running at the moment. And it's not always explicit. For example, the UK is about to set, has set its net zero target for 2050, but it's for greenhouse gases. Whereas most of the IPCC work in net zero, and the graphs I showed earlier on, are for net zero CO2 only. And in general, net zero greenhouse gases will come approximately, say, a decade after net zero CO2. In other words, if the UK gets to net zero greenhouse gases by 2050, it's probably going to be a little bit earlier when it gets to net zero CO2. And also some very interesting issues about how you account for it, that in the land sector. So it is really tricky stuff, and I just have to agree with Pankaj, and I think we need to have this conversation separately afterwards as well. I'd certainly be really interested to. And just to say, Pankaj, we've had a great deal of fun arriving at a definition of offset for the next IPCC glossary. You should have been a fly on the wall to hear some of the discussions.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that as well, Jim. Okay, and I think we may have two more live questions. So I only see them flash up briefly, but I think Cheryl and also Duncan alerted me through the Q&A. So if we could perhaps just take those two, and then I think I might have to start drawing things to a close. So Cheryl, do you want to ask yours, please?
Yes, Cheryl Miles. I'm office manager at Exemplus and an OU graduate in environmental studies, and I've got quite an interest in how we implement good environmental practice in business. But my main thoughts were along the lines of we talked about the 7% decrease in emissions during the COVID pandemic. And my thoughts on that were that it was reported that actually the emissions were still rising in that period. So I was just wondering, in all the models that have been used, do we fully understand how the emissions will carry on rising, even though we're making reductions?
Yeah, I mean, Cheryl, just specifically on the COVID issue, I think we have to be very honest that we do not know how we will come out of this COVID crisis in the medium to long term with emissions, because we don't know what kind of changes of behavior will persist, like the Zoom meetings, the working from home, after we actually come out of the crisis. But basically, there is the underlying drivers like wealth will push emissions upwards, but there are lots of other factors, including having lower carbon energy supply, greater efficiency, perhaps changes of behavior that tend to push us down. And if you look at the UK in particular, there are many countries individual countries where carbon dioxide emissions have peaked and are now on a downward trend in spite of rising economic activity. And one of the challenges is to spread that kind of behavior a bit more widely around countries so that we have an advantage. Recalling sometimes emissions go down because countries have effectively offshored economic activity by importing, and you do need to take account of that as well. But many countries now have declining emissions.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of observations in the Q&A about what the lessons of COVID will be, either from behaviours that are changed that would help, or just the sheer fact that we've shown that when necessary, we can all pull together to get something done. Whether one translates into another, I think, will be a point that will be tested by time. Duncan, are you there to ask a live question?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for giving me the time. It's Professor Duncan Laxon. I've been an environmental scientist now for some 50 years, rather sadly, and an air quality consultant for over 30 years. And during my time as an air quality consultant, I've spent some time thinking about how we can tackle air pollution. I've given presentations at conferences on this. And I've identified a number of factors that I think all need to play their part in bringing about change. And the starting point is good science, but as a scientist, I would say that. But then I think other parties play a role in bringing about change. Campaign groups play an important part because they can help generate public concern. And public concern can potentially lead to behavioural change where people will make changes voluntarily. But probably more importantly, it'll lead to political changes which will come about by way of regulations. But regulations are always better if you're trying to do something very specific and bring about a technological change. So technology's got an important role to play, and we've been discussing some of the technology that's around. And so there's been a lot of discussion in the chat about should it be technology or should it be behavioural change? I would conclude that it needs to be both of those things. And I must say that I originally, probably when I was younger and had a more campaigning hat on in my life, thought that behavioural change was really important and that would bring about the change. But I'm now much more sceptical that behavioural change will really bring about the changes that we need, both for air quality and translated across into climate change. Just some thoughts from my perspective over many years. There is a link between air quality and climate change.
Yeah, well, nothing wrong with being an environmental consultant for 50 years. I mean, you've done practical things to help us on, Duncan. So no problem with that at all. I mean, what I would say in getting action in place, I mean, there's a real ecosystem of different bodies out of there that are part of the, you know, the kind of environmental nexus, and they range from advocacy groups, let's say Extinction Rebellion, through to sort of sober groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, etc. And we all play our parts in it. You know, and I think it needs that diversity of bodies with different places in the spectrum, you know, to actually move us forward. And just to say on air quality and to link it to climate change a bit, these are really intrinsically linked with each other. So, for example, the biggest deployment of electric vehicles is actually in China. And they haven't done it because of climate change. They've done it because of air quality. And so we need to really recognize that in the interaction between the two factors. And if I were going to make another criticism of the models that I showed at the beginning, they don't actually value things like air quality benefits in them. And if you did value the air quality benefits, they would pick up electric vehicles a lot more quickly because the models have not kept up with the real world in certain areas. And following renewable energy costs and the pickup of electric vehicles are two very obvious examples.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I'm just going to ask you a last question from the Q&A, which I think is a very important one. And something I think we've all heard said loud and clear recently, that young people young now are going to bear the brunt really of what happens. And the question is really, how can we've seen a huge amount of engagement from younger people recently. And the question is, how do we build on that and ensure greater engagement and bringing more of those voices into the process?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think so. It's very interesting the number of kind of engagement activities that are building up with citizens' assemblies. There's one in the one in the UK in climate. There's another one just starting up in Scotland as well at the moment. But I do think one of the things that came up in the Just Transition things in Scotland was the issue of making sure that climate change is built not into the education and training system, not just in the sense of sort of O-level exercises and this is what climate change is, but actually training people for the kind of the skills that will be needed to contribute to a low carbon future. And it's very evident that many employers are actually finding if they can attract people if they can provide positions and functions within their organizations that can help people realize, younger people realize where they would like to go more ideologically in terms of the environment, it would be a big benefit. And that these are the, you know, the oil companies say, because I know that's come up on the chart, they find it a lot easier to recruit people if they have a renewables energy division that they can put them in. That is unambiguously the case. And the traditional older kind of business is much less attractive to younger people. So I think we need to exploit that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a new generation of investors will direct capital differently. Yeah. It seems pretty certain, you know, younger investors are much more interested in diverting capital towards these aims. Jim, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. You've answered a lot of questions. They've been very broad ranging. It's been very hard to draw on themes and group them. So many interesting questions and so little time. But can I just say thank you on behalf of everyone. And there are still 200 people online for everything you've done to inform us about this. You've generated a huge amount of questions and chat. We would normally, of course, spill out and have drinks and a few nibbles or something and be able to network. We're not going to be able to do that this time, but we do want to carry on this debate on social media. So you should be being given the details. If you're not a member of the IES, please join. We'd love to have you. We're sure everyone on this call would greatly benefit our group. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Jim, again, but all of the IES organising team, Rihanna particularly, Adam, Gary, of course, for chairing and opening, and for everyone who's been online, and our great respondents. Thank you. Wonderful to have you joining. One of the benefits of this format is to have people join from the other side of the world. So it's been great to see you. So with that, I will wrap up and wish everyone a very good evening, and we look forward to continuing this conversation via social media as far as we can. Thank you all.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.